Hi guys, Miss Sailor here. So, for this week we're talking about the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, okay? So in the 1770s, Great Britain is ruling a vast empire. It's got its American colonies producing useful raw materials, and they're profitably consuming British goods. From Britain's perspective, it's inconceivable that the colonies would wage a successful war for independence. In 1776, they had appeared weak and disorganized. They were no match for the empire. Yet, the Revolutionary War did indeed drag on for 8 years, and in 1783, the 13 colonies prevailed against the British. Great Britain had to pursue a policy of law and order when dealing with a crisis in the colonies in the late 1760s and 1770s. See, relationships between the British and American patriots had worsened over the decade, accumulating into an unruly mob destroying a fortune in tea by dumping it into the Boston Harbor in December of 1773, as we talked about last week, was the Boston Tea Party. So, the British tried to ended up leading to resentment and tensions when they responded with the 1774 Coercion Acts, or the Intolerable Acts. The British tried to disarm insurgents in Massachusetts. This effort also ends up escalating even more so where we have Lexington and Concord. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So, Boston proved to be the epicenter of most of the protests in the colonies. In December of 73, a group of patriots that were mad at the Tea Act boarded the British tea ship docked in Boston Harbor and dumped about $1 million worth into the water. This destruction of the tea radically escalated the crisis between Great Britain and the American colonies. When the Massachusetts Assembly refused to pay for that tea, Parliament enacted a series of laws called the Coercion Acts. Some of the colonists called them the Intolerable Acts. So Parliament designed these laws, which closed the port of Boston, limited the meetings of Colonial Assembly, and disabled all town meetings to punish Massachusetts and try and bring the colony in line. However, what it did was it upset other colonies. They were very troubled and angered by Parliament's response. So in September and October of 1774, all the colonies except Georgia participated in the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Now, in an effort to control and restore law and order in Boston, the British dispatched this man. That is General Thomas Gage. They sent him to New England. He arrived in Boston in May of 1774 as the new royal governor of the province of Massachusetts. They sent him with a large accompaniment of several regiments of British troops. Just like in 1768, the British again are occupying the town of Boston. So, you could see how this would be very aggravating to them. Now, General Gage, he stations 3,500 troops in Boston. And from there, he orders periodic raids on the towns where he knows guns and gunpowder are stockpiled. He's hoping to impose law and order by seizing these guns and gunpowder. As Boston becomes this kind of headquarters of military operations for the British, residents are fleeing the city. Now, Gage's actions lead to the formation of several local rebel militias that are able to mobilize at a minute's time. These are Minutemen, many of whom were veterans of the French and Indian War. All right? New England begins readying for war. So, throughout the late 1774 and into 1775, tensions in New England continued to mount. General Gage knew that a powdered magazine was being stored in Concord, Massachusetts. And on April 19th, 1775, he orders troops to seize these munitions. He also received instructions from London that called for the arrests of the rebel leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Now, he was hoping for secrecy. His troops left under the cover of darkness. They left from Boston. But writers from Boston let the militia know that the British had these plans. Most of you should know the story of Paul Revere. All right, he's just one of the writers. He's just the well-known writer because of the 1860 poem, Paul Revere's Ride. Understand, though, that Paul Revere did not actually make it to Concord. He was captured by the British and he never actually finished his ride. But men and women like him that did these rides, it had the Minutemen meeting the British troops and having skirmishes with them. Now, the first place they have this skirmish is going to be at Lexington. Here you have a lovely image of the Battle of Lexington, an artistic rendition. And then we have the Battle of Concord. Okay? See, until the Battle of Lexington and Concord, both sides had mistakenly assumed that the other would simply back down. Instead, these clashes turned into a resistance movement. It turned a resistance movement into a war of rebellion. Masses of ordinary people were determined to fight for their freedom against the British Parliament and King, who were bent on denying them their civil and legal rights. So the British end up being pushed back to Boston. They retreat to Boston, enduring several ambushes from other militias along the way. Over 4,000 militia men took part in these skirmishes with the British soldiers. You have the famous confrontation is the basis of Emerson's Concord hymn, which was written in 1836, which began with the description of the shot heard around the world. Okay, although people argue and point on both sides that it was someone else that started, it remains unclear who actually fired the first shot that they say is that shot heard round the world, the ringing bell of democracy. Okay? So, after losing the battles of Lexington and Concord, New England fully mobilized for the war. Thousands of militias from towns throughout New England are marching to Boston, and soon the city is besieged by a sea of rebel forces. In June, General Gage is resolved to take Breeders' Hill and Bunker's Hill. Okay, these are high grounds across the Charles River from Boston. It's a strategic site that the rebel militias were taking advantage of. So on June 17th at Bunker's Hill, the British launched 3 assaults on the hill, gaining control only after the rebels run out of ammunition, but at a very high cost. Over 200 are killed and 800 are wounded. Now, despite the victory, General Gage is unable to actually break colonial forces' siege on the city. So he lost many soldiers, but he didn't actually be successful. Now, also, you have this meeting that is going on. In May the 10th, 1775, the Second Continental Congress had reconvened in Philadelphia. They had agreed to form a Continental Army, and they had appointed George Washington as the commander-in-chief of that army. Now, the Battle of Bunker Hill is the day that Washington is named commander-in-chief. They engage in this great battle. Now, 3 weeks after Bunker Hill, in 1775, in July, the Continental Congress they send King George the olive branch petition. Now, they urge him to negotiate. All right? It's a last attempt to end the conflict peacefully. Okay? These guys still considered themselves British subjects. When the Second Continental Congress convened, most of the delegates still wanted Parliament to just restore their rights so that they could resume being loyal British colonists. But the king is mad. He's very upset. He responds by declaring that the colonists are in a state of rebellion. He denounces the Americans as open and avowed enemies. He is very, very mad. So, understand, though, at the time, in 1775, they're not ready to actually call forth for independence. They were not at that point yet. In the end, back in Boston, General George Washington uses these cannons to fortify the high ground around Boston. He puts them in the hills, and he's firing them at the British supply ships. The British can't return fire because they can't elevate their cannons. So they realize they're in an undefendable position, and they end up evacuating from Boston. On March 17, 1776, the British evacuate their troops to Halifax, Nova Scotia, ending the near year-long siege. Now, this is for Boston, but also I want to discuss that in May of 1775, the Mecklenburg Resolves started in North Carolina. It stated that the rebellion against Great Britain had begun. The colonists didn't owe anything or allegiance to Great Britain, and that governing authority had passed to the Continental Congress. Also, you have in Virginia, the royal governor, Lord Dunmore. He raises loyalist forces to combat the rebel colonists, and he tries to use the large slave population to do it. In November of 1775, he issues a decree known as Dunmore's Proclamation. It promises freedom to slaves and indentured servants of rebels who remain loyal to the king and who pledge to fight against the insurgents. Now, this kind of, it creates serious problems, both for the Patriot cause and for the British. In order for the British to put down the rebellion, they needed the support of Virginia landowners who owned slaves, and here they are offering to free slaves. While the Patriot slaveholders in Virginia, many proclaim they act in defense of liberty while they keep thousands in bondage, which the British exploited. So I'm going to stop here, and there's going to be a part 2 that I'm going to discuss a pamphlet that heavily influenced what would become the idea of independence from Great Britain.